Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Stern, and I'm the founder and president of the Endowment for Middle East Truth. And it is a pleasure to welcome you here today to this extremely important and very timely seminar. This morning we awoke to a story in the Wall Street Journal that Israeli intelligence has uncovered yet another Iranian nuclear site that has been operational as recently as 3 months ago and has been operational throughout the time of the nuclear deal. Yesterday, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the people of Israel and showed very clear visual satellite images of the site in a southwestern city south of Isfahan called Abadan. And it shows how the Iranians, as soon as they got wind of the Israeli intelligence, immediately destroyed it and covered up the entire infrastructure. This presents demonstrable proof that the Iranians have been cheating all along. It's incredible, said Prime Minister Netanyahu. Every time we reveal, they try to cover up their tracks. This story comes on the heel of Saturday's announcement that Iran has begun using new, highly advanced centrifuges and methods to speed up the uranium enrichment process, which had been outlawed by the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal. They're now enriching to 20% uranium and have threatened to go even further. And as former CIA Director James Woolsey has explained to another EMET panel several years ago, once you reach 20%, that's the hard part, to get to 20%. Afterwards, it's very easy to get to the 90% level of purification for a nuclear weapon. So this is not just another tactical violation of the deal. It's the very reason why there was a JCPOA to begin with. And yet, ever since the G7 nations met in France last month, the United States, the G7 nations, the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan met. There's been rumors that President Trump has demonstrated a willingness to negotiate with Iran. French President Emmanuel Macron has already met with the Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif and said he is willing to pay as much as $15 billion to try to persuade the Iranians to come back to the table. I should add, without any known preconditions. Was it Karl von Clausewitz who said diplomacy is warfare by other means? I think the Iranians who really invented the Persian shuk know the art of negotiations. They actually should have been the ones to offer the book, The Art of the Deal. All of this while Iran has managed to use the $150 billion in unlocked assets that it got for the deal, plus another $1.7 billion in gold pallets, Swiss francs, and other currencies for a quick hostage exchange to create a land bridge stretching from Tehran through Baghdad, through Damascus to Beirut, and all the way to the Mediterranean, as it's been using its Shiite proxies, Hezbollah and others, and its Shiite populations in those regions and in Yemen and others to create terror and havoc in the region. So here to discuss these ominous developments are two of the nation's most preeminent experts. We have with us, actually, I was supposed to have gotten their bios.
I have it for you.
I am so sorry, but I should know them by heart by now. I'm so sorry. Okay, I'm sorry.
Great American.
They're great, two of the greatest patriots and greatest Americans. Mike Pregent is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He's a senior Middle East analyst, a former adjunct lecturer for the College of International Security Affairs, and a visiting fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. Mike is a former intelligence officer with over 28 years of experience working in security, terrorism, counterinsurgency, and policy issues in the Middle East North Africa, and Southwest Asia. He's an expert in the Middle East and North Africa, and political security issues, counterterrorism, stockholder communications, and strategic planning. Mike served for all of us, and we should be extraordinarily grateful. In Desert Shield and Desert Storm, he served as a liaison officer in Egypt during the 2000 Intifada, and as a counterinsurgency intelligence officer at CENTCOM in 2001, and as a company was company commander in Afghanistan in 2002. Mike holds master's degrees in strategic public relations from the George Washington University, and is a graduate of the U.S. Army Defense Language Institute in Modern Standard Arabic and Egyptian dialect. He's a freelance writer for the Wall Street Journal and a contributing editor to the Daily Beast. And to his left, not politically, but just is Dr. Walid Phares. Dr. Phares is an engaging and highly sought after Middle East expert and really pacer, often predicting trends and situations on the ground years before they actually occur. He's a Fox News expert, an advisor to the U.S. Congress and the European Parliament, and has served as a senior advisor on national security foreign policy to the presidential candidate Mitt Romney in 2012. Walid is the only expert author who predicted the Arab Spring a year before it actually occurred in his pace-setting book, The Coming Revolution: Struggle for Freedom in the Middle East, which I highly recommend. Walid holds an extensive CV and is noteworthy of achievements in the fields of academia, government, strategies, media, and publishing criteria advice on combating terrorism and countering jihadists. Walid holds a PhD in international relations and strategic studies from the University of Miami, and a political science degree from St. Joseph University, and a law degree from the Lebanese University in Beirut, and a master's in international law from the University Jean Moulin in Lyon, France. Without further ado, I think we'll just go in left or still, starting with you, Mike.
Okay. I got in trouble after somebody read my bio. I said, and I play guitar. And I got asked to play the Star Spangled Banner at the U.S. Tennis Open, which was a huge honor. I did it. I made some mistakes. You can always make mistakes talking, so you can always correct them. You can't do that when you're playing a guitar in front of people. Thank God for Jimi Hendrix. They give me a lot of leeway. So, it's an honor to be here. Thank you, Sarah, for having me. I appreciate it. And it's always nice to be on the same stage with this man here to my left. So I've made the argument that this is what war with Iran looks like. We inflate. Can you guys hear me okay? We inflate Iran's capability, its conventional capability, when there is none. Now, there is a direct threat in the Middle East. There's a threat with its militias, with its 2,000-kilometer missile range, ballistic missiles. But we're seeing Iran learn quickly that the status quo is not working, at least with this president. The Islamic Republic is used to provocations and concessions. And with each provocation, we've actually seen more punishments, more sanctions, and that's a good thing. So looking at what Iran is doing and what they're willing to negotiate with, we're talking about these violations of the JCPOA. So you can't hear me, cannot. Is this working at all?
No.
Yeah, bring it closer. It's as close as possible, brother.
Closer.
Yeah. No. So, can you guys hear me? Is there any speakers or just my voice? I
Just
speak
your
military.
voice.
I can speak
Just
loud.
your voice.
You guys hear me okay now?
There's no amplification. There's no mic.
I can't help that.
I'm sorry.
All right. So anyway, Iran's used to having provocations without and gaining concessions. And with each provocation, they've actually realized that now there'll be more punishing sanctions, more actions taken. Do you want me to pause?
No, it's fine.
Okay, so when we look at what Iran's doing in the Strait of Hormuz, in the Gulf of Aden, in Bab el-Mandeb, they're trying to disrupt international waterways, international commerce. it's gotten so difficult for them to do it in the Strait of Hormuz that they've resulted to actually seizing vessels that are part of its own oil smuggling network. That's how bad it is. They seized an Iraqi oil tanker, and they seized this recent tugboat with a Filipino crew. These aren't flagged vessels. These aren't vessels that belong to countries. These are vessels that are actually part of their own oil smuggling operation. When they capture them to demonstrate that they're cheating, it's funny if you watch it. So this new intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability that we put in place in the Strait of Hormuz is making it more difficult for the IRGC Navy to do anything. And it allows us to show in real time. Oh, so now we're good with the mic. All right. So it allows us to show in real time these violations, the IRGC Navy seizing vessels. So that's a good thing. So the regime is quickly learning that provocations in the Gulf isn't going to work. Making threats against American troops in Iraq isn't going to work. Using Shia proxies in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen isn't working either. So now they're trying to step out of the JCPOA. And what I find ironic about that is that none of these European countries that are still in the JCPOA believe they're being cheated on. They're still in the JCPOA. Iran is cheating on them every day. We're out of it, and it gives us more leverage. We have more leverage than we've ever had, and that leverage extends outside of Iran. It goes into North Korea. It goes into dealing with the Taliban in Afghanistan. We're getting away from making deals for promises and trying to get to a place where we make deals for actual concessions and concrete steps. I don't know how Iran became a political issue. You know, it's almost like if you support walking away from the Iran deal, swipe left. I'm not interested. I mean, if you're familiar with any of the dating apps, you know, I'm not, because I'm in a relationship. But you'll get this thing that if you voted for Donald Trump, swipe left. Iran has become as political. If you support the JCPOA, swipe left, and so on and so on. So it's gotten so bad to the point where Lebanese Hezbollah and the Islamic Republic are hoping for an election outcome that favors them and the United States. And we got to get back to bipartisan foreign policy where everybody looks at the Islamic Republic of Iran as a threat, as an enemy. A dedicated enemy to Israel, a dedicated enemy to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, a dedicated enemy to our Sunni regional allies, and a dedicated enemy of the United States. There is no, you know, when I talk to my colleagues on the other sides, you know, the Islamic Republic, you can't defend it. And what I love about what Iran is doing right now, I was on a debate with somebody who was pro-Iran deal and pro-engagement with the regime that couldn't defend any of this. So it was hard for us to actually debate each other. We kept saying, well, I agree with him, I agree with him. It's gotten to the point where Iran is so bad at this that they are actually making it harder and harder for people to defend them. And that's a good thing. They're banking on that clock though, that 13-month clock. And I'll end with this. We have to get to a bipartisan place on Iran because the president loses his re-election bid and Kamala Harris wins. In the second term of Kamala Harris's presidency, Iran will be able to put a warhead on a ballistic missile and be in compliance with the JCPOA. That's how bad it is. And you can't simply just re-engage and get right back into the JCPOA. It's bad. And then Macron has had some very tough language to go along with the $15 billion bribe. Submission to a bribe.
Right. Yeah.
And ballistic missiles have to be part of it. And if you listen to the words of Senator Schumer and Menendez, the words from Senator Menendez and Schumer, they are telling the president, you cannot make a deal with North Korea that has a sunset clause. You can't make a deal with North Korea that isn't ratified as a treaty. It doesn't get 60 votes in the Senate. You can't make a deal with North Korea that doesn't address ballistic missiles. You can't make a deal with North Korea that doesn't address regional behavior. You can't make a deal with North Korea that gives them sanctions relief ahead of concrete steps to dismantle in its entirety its weaponized nuclear program. That's good, because all of those things were absent in the JCPOA. So if we take the words of Senator Schumer and Senator Menendez, we should have some bipartisan support for this. And I've talked to some of my colleagues that would be in a Democrat National Security Council, and they agree. We can't just simply jump back into the Iran deal. It was that bad. Now, former President Obama was right when he said, Iran will not have a nuclear weapon on my watch. We just have to remember he left 9 months later, so. All right, I'll end with that.
Walid?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you so much, Sarah, for extending this invitation. Always a pleasure to be back to your great foundation. Michael, very happy to play guitar as well, so if you're in the band. And my resume, I guess, was prior to 2015, because then I was appointed with Donald Trump as a foreign. Just kidding. I'm going to be brief, but I'm going to be a little bit wider in terms to complete what Michael has covered. I would like to talk about the root causes in a very quick way of how we got here and why the Iran regime is now able to expand from Tehran to the Mediterranean Sea, almost having geopolitical borders with Israel, unthinkable of many years ago, and how the Iran regime is surrounding, technically, Saudi Arabia from the north. That would be Iraq because of the militias that they have. From the south, which is Yemen, where they have allies, who are the Houthi militias. And how, as a matter of fact, this morning I was on Fox discussing precisely what you have mentioned, how the Iranians have been fooling, and I'm using this term like as a political science term, the international community, specifically the Europeans, in terms of what they are achieving under an executed Iran nuclear deal. What they are achieving, to be very quick here, is the fact that on the one hand they received everything they wanted to receive, including the $150 billion. And what do you think they're going to buy with the $150 billion? All the toys that they want in terms of anti-aircraft advanced missiles, renewing their tank force, the drone force, paying more for the militias. So that was a great investment. The Iran deal for the Iranian regime is one of the best achievements that they have been able to secure for many decades. And I'm very glad that President Trump withdrew from that agreement very quickly, as soon as he could, because we have domestic issues here are very difficult to address, were very difficult to address. On the other hand, the Iranian regime was able to deploy and support militias in Iraq, Hashid Shabi, in Syria. We can't count how many militias they have deployed, including obviously the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. In Lebanon, it has been secured since 1990 and again in 2000 under the control of Hezbollah. So if you look at the map, the geopolitical map, from the western borders of Iran to the eastern Mediterranean, it's a plateau basically controlled by the Iranian regime. We're talking about three countries. I call them in the Arab press colonies. These are three colonies of the Iranian regime. That's how they control them. There was one rupture between 2014 and 2017. It was not due to us. It was due to ISIS. ISIS emerged in 1/3 of Iraq and 1/3 or more of Syria, and it ruptured this continuum between Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. And we went in with our allies and reduced ISIS. Now here's the major problem. There were two major problems with our foreign policy. One was the initial attitude that Washington had as of 2009. Why? Because upon coming to the White House, the previous administration, the Obama administration, changed the posture of the US in the Middle East from one that was fighting Al-Qaeda, fighting the jihadists in Iraq, containing the Assad regime, and putting the Iran regime under tremendous pressure. Remember, if you visualize the map, we were in Iraq, the gentleman was in Iraq, and we were in Afghanistan. So if you are the Iranian national security team, you will be looking to your East, American forces, NATO forces. You will be looking to your West, American and coalition forces. You will be looking across the Gulf, Arab coalition forces, not yet coalition, but Arab countries. So you were basically surrounded. And what was to happen in these situations was that because of those pressures, there would be an opportunity for the Iranian opposition inside the country to rise. And that is exactly what happened. The first spasm was in 1999 when there was a nationwide strike by students on campuses. It should have told us that this phenomenon is coming. And it did happen in 2009 when more than 1.5 million Iranians, 60% of whom were under the age of 20. That's so significant. So these are not the old opposition people. These were young people who were born after the oldest opposition movement was formed in 1979. And here's the initial strategic sin, S-I-N, by Washington, by the Obama administration. We abandoned them. So history gives you an opportunity. You are in Iraq, you are in Afghanistan, you are in the region. You have provoked the withdrawal of the Assad army from Lebanon. Hezbollah is exposed. And in the middle of this, you have a huge revolt rising in Iran. And what do? Quote, we don't want to be seen meddling with Iranian domestic politics. Are you kidding me? This would have avoided everything that followed for a decade and a half. Because had we supported those demonstrators, and they were not asking for more than statements, then you would have had not only the demonstrators in Tehran, but in Tabriz and every other city. Then they would have been joined by the Kurds, 7 million of them living in Iran, then the Arabs of Ahwaz, then the Baluch, then the Azeris, then God knows what. The problem could have been solved. Of course, it would have taken 1 or 2 years. Instead, we have nothing to do with them, which meant, in Iranian regime language, go ahead, do what you have to do. So the opposition was smashed. Not only that, President Obama sent a letter to Grand Ayatollah Khamenei that same month, telling him we would like to engage with you. The genesis of the Iran deal was done in June of 2009, not 2014 and 15. From on arrival, the team of the previous administration, I'm not political, I'm just analyzing from a national security perspective. Okay, so I don't deal with domestic politics and what have you. On foreign affairs and national security grounds, we made the initial mistake by changing the direction from the previous administration, which was not that brilliant, especially since 2006, when the majority changed in Congress. The previous administration had done everything it could, and it was paralyzed in terms of Iraq policies and regional policies. It has achieved many things, but then the majority in Congress changed that. But then the administration that followed, the Obama administration, changed the direction. So I am not surprised, as a historian, that all the events between 2009 and 2015 led to what it led to the deal. So there were years and years and years of Obama administration not willing to do two things in the Middle East till 2016. One, anything that would upset the Iranian leadership and stop them from negotiating what will become the Iranian nuclear deal. So comes the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring. And we had many opportunities. Here's in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, anywhere. Had there been a different policy or a different administration altogether, we would have ended many things. But in any opportunity where we could have organized an opposition against Hezbollah, ended the situation in Syria, we had most of the components ready, or in Iraq, what we have done was to make sure that the Iran nuclear deal to come will actually not be bothered or destabilized by any of our moves. That was the policy for many years. So we lost the opportunity in Iraq, for example, because, as you know, we withdrew from Iraq at the end of 2011 for the sole purpose of making sure that after the withdrawal, we're going to cut the deal with the Iranians. So we withdrew without ensuring behind our back the presence of a coalition that goes from Sunni moderates, Kurds, Shia moderates, making sure that they will be the one to take over. Instead, who took over? the Shia pro-Iranian militias. I mean, it's almost like predictable. So we lost Iraq to Iran in 2011. In Syria, we could have, at the beginning, the first 6 to 7 months, put pressure. There was strategies could have been possible. No, Bashar al-Assad is a reformer. Remember those statements? On and on and on, including in Yemen. So I wouldn't blame any wrong step over the past 2 to even 3 years. But everything that happened between 2009 and 15 was predictable. So first mistake, and I'm going to go faster here, was that we adopted a different policy with regard to Iran, allowing Iran to do everything if they promised that would deliver a deal. They delivered a deal, and the deal was bad by itself. Because in that deal, and we don't want to go through the details of the deal, but today, this morning, was an opportunity to realize that they could, as you said, go by the deal, get the nuke a few years from now, and establish a huge dome, you know, the Israeli dome. The Iranians are building a regional dome. They got the money, bought the missiles, so now the price for us or any other administration in the future to go in action against Iran is much higher. The second mistake, which has probably not much to do with today's discussion, but I'm going to mention it, the Obama administration policy towards the Muslim Brotherhood. We have lost Egypt for a moment. We've lost Tunisia, we've lost Libya, part of southern Yemen, because there was this approach that the Muslim Brotherhood are moderates and they're going to help us against Al-Qaeda. That's the second, are you kidding me? It took actually to the people and forces of these countries to stand against the Ikhwan or Brotherhood regime, as what happened in Egypt, where 30 million Egyptians, remember we discussed that many times, and of course Sisi's Egyptian army, to make sure that the Ikhwan are not going to control Egypt. Because imagine a nuclear Iran plus Ikhwan Egypt in the region, that's not the best choice that we would have in the future. So now that Trump administration came to office, it inherited 8 years or 7 years of an Obama administration policy with regard to Brotherhood and with regard to Iran. Not an easy thing. That's different from the Bush administration coming in 2000. It was not that bad. No, it was very bad. On top of it, I'll be slightly political because that's reality. The first 2 years of the Trump administration was a struggle against these domestic pressures, right? That you all know about. It's not easy in the first 2 years of that administration to handle these massive issues of foreign policy and Middle East policies with all what was happening in DC. The first, I would say, rise to change that policy really happened when President Trump went to Saudi Arabia, to Riyadh, and addressed 50 Arab and Muslim leaders. Call on them to create a coalition. Second, when of course he changed the U.S. policy with regard to Israel, with all these big moves, Jerusalem, Golan, but even beyond that, strategic relationship with the Israelis. And third one was the bigger one regarding today's subject, when he withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal. And then a cascade of decisions, increasing the sanctions, designating the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization. My goodness, this should have happened 15 years before that, or at least under the Obama administration. So now, finally, we are at zero. We were minus many, many points, maybe 50 points. Now we are at zero. That's why the days, the months, and the years to come, including all the way to the end of this administration election, and then the next 4 years, hopefully it will continue, that policy will continue, are going to be the measurement by which we will see if we will be able to defeat this military expansion of the Iranian regime, make sure that ISIS and the jihadists will not come back territorially to the region, and make sure that beyond that, we're going to have a new coalition in the Middle East that would start producing peace. That's how I see the region, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much. As the moderator, I'm going to take the liberty of a few first questions, or one. I'm sure most of you remember in 2015 there was an article in the New York Times. It was a profile of Ben Rhodes. It was called the fiction writer who became President Obama's foreign policy guru. And he was the one who bragged about getting newly minted journalists into this room to create this echo chamber where they would just echo the points that various far left wing groups and the Obama administration were making, groups such as Plowshares. And then in 2016, Ben Rhodes said, should a future president tear up the agreement, Iran would restart its nuclear weapons program, meaning future leaders are chained to the agreement, whether the American public likes it or not. You know, I find this unbelievably almost immoral. You know, they were selling a bill of goods and they bragged about it. But beyond that, you know, the agreement was negotiated with the P5+1 countries, and as you said, it never went to the Senate for ratification. Instead, President Obama went to the United Nations, and we need, according to the American Constitution, this was an arms control treaty. So my first question is very difficult, and that's, if you were the President of the United States today, how would you deal with this right now? Mike?
Deal with Iran.
Deal with the Iran deal with the fact that there are so many pressures from the E3 nations and the European community, you know, to renegotiate, to restart the deal. What would you say?
I would argue, I would want a team of rivals, by the way. We know that Ambassador Bolton has been relieved of his duties. I think it's always good to have a team of rivals. You know, have Bolton disagree with you and say, okay, great, this is what I want you to do. I would rely on the nuclear proliferation treaty. The JCPOA, in my opinion, was unnecessary. It was a way to give Iran economic benefits, sanctions relief, to do what they were already doing, cheating on the NPT. And the NPT is strong. And Russia and China, I've said in meetings with Russian think tank members that were close to Putin's office, they have no interest in the Islamic Republic having a nuclear weapon. But they were all set to jump in on the economic benefits that the JCPOA allowed. With this economic investment in Iran from European countries, Russia and China went in quickly to secure military contracts with Iran, to secure oil contracts with Iran. And the best thing about Iran squandering the opportunities of the JCPOA. When I testified in front of Congress, I said, listen, there should be a JCPOA today if they didn't use that money to prop up Assad, if they didn't build new militias in Iraq and Syria, if they didn't give the Houthis lethal aid. I would stay out of the JCPOA. The United States is not isolated. Leaving the Iran deal did not isolate the United States. It's a $20 trillion economy. Europe is more concerned about having good relations with the US, and Iran's economy looks worse and worse with each passing day. And it's not the attractive economic investment that it was in 2015. Again, my biggest thing here is if Iran rushes towards a bomb, even in the JCPOA, it was always a military option. They were still 6 months to 1 year away. And if they rushed towards a bomb, there would be a military option. And we've seen Israel hit these militias with impunity. They've hit them in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. And no doubt in my mind that our offensive cyber capabilities and the military capabilities of our allies could deal with the Islamic Republic if it rushed towards a bomb. And that's all we really need to be concerned about. They were already cheating in the dark on the NPT, yet Ben Rhodes and others knew they were cheating on existing UN Security Council resolutions, yet they thought that, you know, they're cheating out in the open. They thought they were adhering to the JCPOA in the shadows, and it made no sense.
Walid?
I'll add that the administration right now should act as if the nuclear Iran deal never existed. Move forward. Have to be on the offensive, politically, geopolitically, and beyond. Not to worry about the clients of the nuclear agreement. But at the same time, be comprehensive, be integrated, and make sure to have alternative plans to move forward. So I am optimistic in the sense that we have a coalition that didn't exist before. Obviously, Israel and the United States have better relationship now than under the previous administration. They can coordinate, they can exchange information, they could do many things. And Michael mentioned some of the things being done in at least 3 countries. That wasn't there.
Without protest from the people.
Without protest.
Without protest.
Absolutely.
That's huge.
Second, what we didn't have at all was a coalition of Arab countries. The Arab coalition. Saudis are at war with Iran. The UAE as well. Bahrain. Thirdly, we have an extended Iranian opposition that is much wider than it was before, not just in exile, but inside the country. Add to it that internationally, some of the countries which were really chained by commitment to the deal because they were, listening to what Brussels was saying, Commission, have changed. I'll give you 2 examples. In Eastern Europe, you have 3 to 4 countries that are working openly with us, the so-called Warsaw Process. Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia. I know they are small countries, but it counts to have more European countries. Italy goes and comes back. The oppositions in the other countries are also putting a lot of pressure. You cross the Atlantic, Brazil has shifted position. Don't discount that. Because now, last week, there was an agreement between Brazil, Colombia, Paraguay, and Argentina to go clean up the tri-border area from Hezbollah. All of this was not there. So now our architects here in Washington have this opportunity to do a lot of work with a very wide coalition. Plus, I want to borrow one point that Michael has mentioned. Russia is not going to engage in full war because of Iran. It's going to back Iran till as much as it can. But if there are major events happening in the Middle East, specifically domestic events in Iran, Russia would deal with the next Iran. China, even further, China has all the trade problems with us. Iran is not really their national security. They buy oil from them, but they're not gonna. So there is a situation where this Trump administration can do a lot. Hopefully it could be given the time, because this is not something to do in a few months, not even in a year, beyond that. So that would be my point that I would like to make.
Okay. In 2009, as you mentioned, there were protesters on the streets of Tehran holding up signs, "Obama, where are you?" Talking about the awful human rights situation. And I think, it was a really a national shame that we did go in and help them. But I think there are stirrings still within Iran. Is there anything that can be done, or that that might be done, that you could talk about to bolster up the opposition in Iran right now? And I know that the human rights situation is still abysmal for them.
What a great question, because it will allow me very quickly to state what are the potentials and what we should do, because we're not doing everything we should do. Potentials are significant. The generation that did 2009 is now how many years? A decade older or so. There are two generations that rose since. Those who were 10 years old and the younger people. So we have a very large contingent of youth inside Iran that is ready, and actually they are taking action without us, without a thing from us. Remember the Iran protests last year? And now it's reaching labor, women, minorities, we have mentioned that. And of course, meanwhile, the outside opposition has organized better. But at the same time, we are coming from a very difficult situation whereby the early part of the Obama administration has ended a lot of the programs that were destined to help the Iranian opposition. There was a budget of $50 million designated to help the Iranian opposition. It was taken out in preparation for the Iran deal. So there are many things that the Trump administration can and should do, and very quickly reform our broadcast in Persian and Farsi. Some elements in those areas and other areas are still, very sympathetic to the Iran deal. We need to do a better, transparent organization of the arms, the tools that we have, so that we can work a partnership with the Iranian opposition. We need to recognize them. Look what we've done with Guaido in Venezuela. Imagine what would it cost to recognize leadership of the Iranian opposition invite them to Congress, invite them to the White House, just give them that visibility. In the Middle East, visibility would ensure you huge energy from inside the country. So these are some of the things we could do.
To follow up on Walid's point, we need to put a spotlight. Can you guys hear me okay? Is this thing off again? We need to put a spotlight on these protesters. The Arab Spring began with somebody setting themselves on fire in Tunisia. We had an Iranian woman set herself on fire yesterday. She died from her wounds. She set herself on fire because she was handed a prison sentence for going to a sporting event.
Soccer.
Yeah. And this is why the Islamic Republic should be a bipartisan deal. If you care about dissidents being put in prison, if you care about homosexual rights, if you care about women's rights, if you care about these things, Iran is built for bipartisan condemnation. The Islamic Republic is built for it. And all the protesters are asking for right now is a spotlight. Meaning U.S. media should cover it. When the protests are out there, yet U.S. media actually cover the protests for the regime, or the demonstrations in support of the regime. The difference is the protesters against the regime were risking their lives, and the protesters out there in support of the regime were out there because their life would be risked if they didn't. That's what this Islamic Republic is. We have Americans more shocked about a TV show, Handmaid's Tale, than what's going on in reality in Iran, in Afghanistan, and other places.
A quick point to add, to confirm what Michael is saying about bipartisanship. I remember, and I've been spending many years in these buildings, that the strongest position with regard to changing Iran were coming from the Democratic Party. Remember all these members of all these committees, the Lieberman approach. That is important to be reinvested now in a bipartisan approach.
Exactly.
Okay, one last question from me, and I'll take the questions from the audience. In terms of the encroachment of Hezbollah in Lebanon, my most favorite moment in relatively recent history was the Cedars Revolution, when Christians felt proud to walk in the streets of Beirut without fearing for their lives. Now we see that Hezbollah has taken over a plurality of their parliament in Lebanon, and that they have the medical portfolio. Have you heard at all from Lebanese Christians or from others? I mean, we see that Hezbollah is taking over houses with which to launch missiles aimed at Israel. Is there any kind of outcries or anything that we could be doing to support the minorities in these countries?
Wow, this is so close to home,
Yeah.
initial home, of course. I'd like to give you a quick report about the Lebanon situation. I've been very close to working in Washington with regard to Lebanon over 3 decades now. So there are benchmarks. The first one was in 1990, when I actually came to America. Assad's army and Hezbollah invaded the last free area that existed in Lebanon, which was defended mostly by the Christians, but there were some Sunni Shia Jews defending for the previous 15 years. That basically killed the resistance, the territorial resistance. That, for example, the Kurds are still lucky to have an area. 2 areas now they have, northern Iraq and northeast Syria. The Lebanese Christians have lost territorial enclave. The second one was that despite the Syrian occupation from 1990 to 2005, 15 years of Syrian occupation, there was a revolution, which was called the Cedars Revolution. It was very interesting because it was made by younger generations of Lebanon who were not even part of the war. And what was interesting is that though a majority of the protesters were Christian, there were hundreds of thousands of Sunni moderates, anti-Iran, and of Druze, and some Shia liberal. That's a transformation inside Lebanon. Now, obviously the immigrants, the Lebanese diaspora helped them. There was a resolution at the UN, the Bush administration helped, so on and so forth. So there was briefly, it's like the Spring of Prague, about a year or 2, where there was a government in Lebanon that represented the Cedars Revolution. I could detail the mistakes made in Washington and mistakes made by the Lebanese politicians themselves. The bottom line is Hezbollah's very smart strategies, unfortunately beginning with a series of assassinations of leaders, and we haven't budged here, and actions and provoking a war with Israel in 2006. They did everything by their book, so by 2008 they recaptured Lebanon. So there was that brief moment between 2005 and 2008, 3 years, and then Hezbollah took that. But this time Hezbollah is much more efficient. What they have done was to penetrate every single community with their own people. And recently they have invested even more. And someone should ask me, where are they getting this additional money? Duh, the $150 billion offered to Iran, piece of it. Yes, piece of it was reinvested in Hezbollah's strategies to penetrate all these communities. So now it's much more difficult than before. I don't want to talk about the reinvestment in lobbies here and in Europe, and I will only mention one thing. Hezbollah, and there's an op-ed that was published this morning in the Independent Arabiya that I published, in which I've exposed the Iranian strategy to penetrate Middle East Christian communities. This is very dangerous, what I'm saying. For the last 3 years, Iran has been investing in penetrating Christians in Iraq, in Syria, and in Lebanon. Not the communities, but politicians. That penetration has a result in Washington and in Paris and in Rome and in London. They have formed leadership and lobbies and federations who would come here and say, oh, we are threatened by ISIS. We are threatened, yes, you are threatened by ISIS. But Assad is nice to us, and Iran is nice to us, and the Iraqi government and the militias are nice to us. So Iran is manipulating even now the leadership of the Christian communities. Thankfully, there are enough courageous politicians among the Kurds, the Assyrians, the Lebanese Christians to block that. But this is where one of the administration needed action is to have a policy with regard to Christian minorities, not just in the principles. You know, we have a lot of statements made here by the executive branch and by the Congress. They need to actually work with these NGOs. The same apply to the Iranian opposition should apply to the Middle East Christians.
And now, I'd like to open any further questions. Yes.
What do you believe could be done to get Democrats on board for a bipartisan coalition against Islam?
Okay, I'll do my quick one. I'll visit only one aspect because there are many aspects. And what we see right now, the transformation of the opposition, Democratic Party, is something unusual. I haven't seen it before, but politicians are always sensitive to the constituencies, to the base. And I think the Iranian opposition could do a lot. See, it's all connected. If we support the Iranian opposition could go to the politicians of the Democratic Party, not all of them, but those who are sensitive to this, and make the case. And many Iranians are members of the Democratic Party. California, New York, elsewhere. So this is one way of doing it.
I would say the biggest thing we have to do is get away from these whataboutism arguments that you hear from politicians. When I talk about Iran, the first thing is, what about Saudi Arabia? Well, let's talk about Iran first, and then we can talk about a necessary ally, Saudi Arabia, and a dedicated enemy, the Islamic Republic. And let's treat them differently. So I think we need to remind Democrats that, and Republicans too. I mean, there's Republicans that want to jump back into Iran bill also.
Yeah.
That ballistic missiles are already covered by UN Security Council resolutions, and Iran is cheating. Proliferation is already covered in UN Security Council resolutions, and Iran is cheating. Human rights violations, again. All of these things are already cheating in the open, and yet you keep getting these cheerleaders and these advocates that say that they're adhering in the shadows. I think you get Democrats with human rights issues, with the persecution of homosexuals, the hijab, women being put in prison for taking off the hijab. These are all traditional liberal values, and something everybody can get behind. With regards to the nuclear deal, the JCPOA was a farce. It was simply a way to have a foreign policy achievement and reward Iran with economic sanctions so that American companies could dip in as well. I mean, we have the big Boeing contract, and these are the jobs you don't want, is what I would say. These are not the jobs you're seeking. You do not want to work for the Islamic Republic because you're gonna be watched. But this should be easy, but these whataboutism arguments, I think, are just entry-level argument tactics that shouldn't work. But unfortunately, they do.
Yes.
I have a question you may not be able to answer. Obviously, if Macron hasn't figured out what the lady from Rockville figured out, that our former president, was almost a Shiite sympathizer. We now have a new sheriff in town. We have a president who rewards good behavior and punishes bad behavior. That's the opposite of what we had. We had rewarded bad behavior. I watched, a couple weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal said, and I watch it, that Israel is in a de facto war starting in July. My girlfriend in Nornit tells me the same thing. She feels as an Israeli, they're in a de facto war. Nobody mentions it, Wall Street Journal, that's it, that Israel is bombing Iraqi installations, Iranian installations in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen. Okay, so that's going on. And I'm watching this president, and I'm getting a little scared. I love everything he's done. Of course, his personality is a little unusual. And I watched what he did in Afghanistan this week. We're watching him and we're thinking, you're not dumb. The Democrats think you're dumb. You're not dumb. What are you doing here in Afghanistan? You crazy? And then you watch him turn on a dime and do exactly what you think he would have done. And you say, okay, the whole thing was a feint. This was an act. He did this brilliantly. But what I'm worried about when you talk about Bolton right now is you've got this guy Jared Kushner, okay? He sounds like he obviously has the president's love and admiration. Sounds like a sophisticated man with a plan. But I don't know if that plan is a little too sophisticated and a little too naive. Is there a plan that's going to shock all of us soon into thinking, Trump, what have you done? I mean, do you guys have any skinny into the White House? I mean, it's very complicated. And I'm thinking something's going to happen, and you're feeling like, oh God, what's going on here?
We'll give Michael first. So he can have enough time to think about it.
I would just say that Trump has prided himself on keeping everyone guessing, and I would say us included.
Oh, so you don't have a secret to tell me.
I know a couple things. The president doesn't want to be embarrassed, and the president likes to get flattered. If the deal looks like it's going to embarrass him, he'll walk away from it. If the deal looks like it's going to flatter him, he'll go with it until he thinks it's going to embarrass him. I don't know.
Okay.
I want a team of rivals. I like that he had Bolton there. I don't like that he has a yes man at SecDef now. I want a team of rivals and a commander-in-chief that does, that has his people do what he wants them to do. The Washington Post made the mistake of making Trump the adult in the room when they criticized Bolton. So now he's got rid of Bolton, so that they're almost in the position where they have to praise him for it. And that'll be fun to watch. We don't know. As confused as you are, and I am, so is the enemy. And maybe that's a good thing.
This side of the room over. I should remember everyone's name. I apologize if I don't. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Regarding the sanctions against Iran, I'm a retired nuclear engineer, and through reading the Federal Register and other things, I'm aware that Exelon, the largest operator of nuclear plants in the United States, has obtained permission from the NRC to load Russian fuel into their reactors. And the company that's supplying this Russian fuel also built 2 reactors in Iran. And I know there are waivers to these, there are nuclear waivers to the Iranian sanctions. Where does all this fit in?
These are things that Senator Cruz has brought up, Senator Rubio's brought up, dealing with Iran's civilian nuclear program. I agree with you that it's suspect, and you can see the pure business model at play here when it comes to the Islamic Republic and what you can and can't do. Those are things that 2 prominent senators have talked about, and I'm sure the president listens to them. I don't think he listens to them and then acts the way they want them to. But it's concerning. I see it as hypocrisy. I see it as a backdoor. You know, we have to remember what happened with North Korea when we did similar things, trying to ensure that they had a civilian nuclear program, and look where they are now. This looks like that. I mean, this man is in the business of predicting things. I mean, the Iran deal looks a lot like what North Korea got under the Clinton administration.
Two short points and no prediction in this one. What the public doesn't know, most of the public, is that we have, as U.S. government, a lot of business going on with Russia, regardless of even the sanctions that we're putting on them, which is a little bit strange. One example would be NASA. Our space program is working day in, day out with Russia in terms, you may have known that. The engines, I mean, most of our engineers are flying to Russia every day for the for the International Space Station, so on and so forth. So part of the technological dialogue or work that we have with Russia has to do with some matters that are our national, now space, national security, so on and so forth. This is one point. The other point is sanctions around Iran may not be as perfect as we think, because Iran can and did do business with Russia, with China, Brazil before Bolsonaro, and we didn't act much because it's too big of a piece to chew. So I would say it's fine. If you ask me, if I'm in the NSC and I'm asked it, don't worry about the imperfectness of the sanctions. Part of the sanctions are really biting. What we need to do is move forward with the opposition. Because all of that we're going to get to a constellation of sanctions then the Iranian regime will be comfortable with. You know, they get to a point, okay, do all the sanctions, we are surviving. That's not what we should settle for. So sanctions as much as we can, but move for the change would be my answer.
Yes, thank you very, very much, Sarah, for this great opportunity, and thank you for your time. Of course, we know President Obama foreign policy did many, many mistakes, and especially about Iran. But I strongly believe the administration did mistake also. Look what happened in October 16, 2017, when Shia militia, those militia led by Qasem Soleimani, attacked Kirkuk and attacked Peshmerga, loyal ally to United States, by U.S. weapon. The administration did nothing. And the administration abandoned Kurdistan's referendum for independence. Referendum was very, very successful, democratic, and peaceful. And strong majority of Kurdish people voted yes. Any comments about that, please?
Let Michael begin and I'll approve.
But as you know, I stood for the referendum. I was surprised at the level of abandonment that Iraq faced, you know, from a U.S. administration that I thought would be very pro getting it right in Iraq. And getting it right in Iraq was seeking out stability in an area that has proven to be an ally, and that being Kurdistan or Erbil, Dahuk, and you know, other places. The Ambassador Crocker said it best. The U.S. position was so negative against the referendum that it green-lighted Qasem Soleimani using militias to go into Kirkuk. And Brett McGurk and others denied that the militias were present. And you could see the flags being risen in Kirkuk. Kitab Hezbollah flags, the Sabal Haq flags. Hadi al-Amri and Mohandes having a ceremony in Kirkuk at the governor's residence. These things, I mean, as a former military advisor and embedded advisor with the Peshmerga in Iraq, it's embarrassing. I was embarrassed to go back and face my friends after this abandonment. And as you work counterinsurgency and you build these allies, and they tend to be Kurds, whether they be the Kurds in Iraq or the Kurds in northern Syria, we can't have these recent examples of betrayal and expect special operators at the E6 and E7 level to be able to build trust and rapport with indigenous forces when they can simply open their phone and look on the internet and see these examples. And that is terrible for successful foreign policy.
So this is a public forum. So I'll cover as much as I can in a public forum, these issues. But that does not mean that there are no deeper considerations, which will come in time. It did not apply, what you have mentioned about abandoning KRG or the Kurds and the other allies, and the issue of Kirkuk and the issue of referendum is not orphan. There were many other issues in the Middle East that were inherited from the previous administration. I'll give you a few examples. The Sisi government in Egypt, there were resistances within our own bureaucracy. Because, you know, and we have to be clear with our public if we have some additional knowledge. One thing is President Trump and the White House and what they like and what they know and what they are helped in knowing. And another thing is those layers of bureaucracies. It takes time for this bureaucracy to get the memo. And that's the side, I didn't want to elaborate much, but now I have to, about the first 2 years and few months of this administration. We had two policies going on. A new policy by the Trump administration, which at the end of the day burst into reality, like withdrawing from the nuclear deal. If he was comfortable with his bureaucracies, he would have made that declaration in March, April, or May of 2017. There were a lot of resistances. That's on the Iran deal. There were a lot of resistances on Egypt with regard to the Muslim Brotherhood. We were promised that this would be in Congress and there would be an executive order. Nothing of that happened. It's not because the administration doesn't want to. It is facing a significant resistance. So when it came, I followed, very closely the issue of Kurdistan, referendum, and Kirkuk. And as Michael, I was not happy. If I was inside the White House, my voice would have been heard that there are ways to handle the matter. You could handle a referendum in Kurdistan while keeping everybody in Iraq, especially the prime minister, under the aegis of coalition. Because remember, when ISIS was threatening Baghdad, the Kurds were fighting and stopping ISIS in Kurdistan. The price of that should have been at least to accept a referendum, at least to negotiate, at least to tell the Kurds, come to Baghdad, come to Washington, let's have a negotiation. But what the Iranian side has done, they said, okay, now we are fighting ISIS, let's be nice to the Kurds, let's be nice to everybody else, and once ISIS was shrunk, thanks to our Air Force and forces, then they said, no, there is no referendum. Then they said, no, we want Kirkuk back. So in this lost time between the Trump administration recapturing itself and going on the offensive, the timing of the referendum probably, I don't want to blame here, but I want to just analyze as a historian, maybe the time of the referendum was not timed well with the capacity of the Trump administration to deliver on the referendum. But I'll leave it to historians to judge on this one.
There's one additional thing there. Barzani was simply asking for a U.S. statement, a public statement of support, that at some point they would support a referendum, and we couldn't even give them that. And that was I think, an embarrassment. But it wasn't the president. The president deferred to bad people making bad decisions. Brett McGurk being the guy. I have no problem saying that.
I do have to say that I felt terrible because we at EMET would like to believe that there's some synergy between morality and our foreign policy. And when we saw the Peshmerga, the Kurds shedding their blood for us in the fight against ISIS, I think, they deserve to be supported. And what happened in Afrin was a really black mark in our history. And I hope it's not going to be repeated. And I hope that the president won't be seduced by Erdogan, who's talking about a safe zone, and it might be safe for the Turks, but is it going to be safe for the Kurds? That's what we have to know. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to step back for just a moment. I served in the U.S. Navy during the first Gulf War and beyond, and prepared our sailors to serve and to go to Iraq and beyond. And what I think during that particular time, although I never spoke about it, but during the Bush administration, that taking down Saddam Hussein brought great strength to Iran, and now we're dealing with the aftermath of all of that.
So, you know, I don't like time travel foreign policy. You know, I get it. I can't go back in a time machine and make sure we didn't disband the Iraqi army and make sure we didn't do this and that. But I agree with you. I wrote that our failures during the Iraq War basically handed Iraq to Iran. But that took place in 2009, 10, 11, 12, and beyond. In 2007, we finally got it right. I was in Iraq 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, working reconciliation issues, working with the Sons of Iraq, working counter Iran, working these militias. We had Qais Khazali in detention, Duke from Lebanese Hezbollah in detention, Laith Khazali, Haji Shibble, all these bad actors that are now prominent politicians in Iraq and militia leaders. So we basically handed Iraq to Iran by building a security force, partnering with the security force, building it and then partnering with it to go after its own people. Not to go against an adversary, not to go against Iran, but to actually go against its Sunni and Kurdish populations. We've actually seen the militias go against their Shia population in Basra. You know, and all they were asking for, they weren't asking for free college education and you know, open borders and things like that. They were asking for internet, electricity, and water, and the militias cracked down on that. They did burn down the Iranian consulate. I thought that was a good thing, but our State Department condemned them for using violence instead of saying, hey, the situation's really bad down here, nobody trusts the government. They just burned down the Iranian consulate because they believe there's too much Iranian interference in Iraq. We've made a lot of mistakes. I often use an analogy that if we ran wars like Belichick runs the Patriots, we would have been out of Afghanistan in 3 years and out of Iraq in 4 years. Instead, we run foreign policy like Daniel Snyder of the Washington Redskins. We change out teams every year, hoping for a Super Bowl, and we never get it. So, Iraq is now in a place. I talked to a former commanding general of Iraq. If you know who I've worked for, is one of the officers that I worked for, you know, at the 4-star level. He said Iraq is better than it's ever been. And I said, sir, everything you wanted us to stop in 2007 is now on steroids. And now with these Israeli airstrikes, and that's why this is so important. I asked a couple of advisors to General O and General Petraeus, General Odierno and Petraeus, would you have ever thought Israel would be conducting airstrikes in Iraq? I'm like, no. Would you have ever thought the Iraqi people would welcome it? Mm-hmm. Now, the Iraqi people don't view these airstrikes as airstrikes against Iraqis. They view these airstrikes in Iraq as against Iran. That's how bad it is and how good it is at the same time. That people are finally realizing, Iraqis are finally realizing, you have 70% of the population is under the age of 35. They do not want this malign Iranian influence in the country anymore. They want a relationship with the United States that is based on entrepreneurship, business investment, education. They want to see less diplomats and less military guys. They're happy to see the military component when it deals with ISIS and curbing Iranian influence, but they want to see American support and dedication to a population that wants to go to school in the U.S., that wants a future. My whole thing is keeping 10-year-old Americans from fighting in Iraq 10 years from now. All right? And our foreign policy is driving us right towards that. If I was a betting man, I'd say we're going to be in Iraq in 10 years, not only facing the next iteration of ISIS or Al-Qaeda, but also this new Shia militia, you know, organization that has views outside of Iraq. You had Iraqi militias fire rockets on Israel, but just be short of the border. That's where we're at. And it's that bad. And if you follow some of the analysis from some of my colleagues in other think tanks, this Iraq shouldn't be possible. And here, this is where we are. That's how bad it is. So hopefully the president's taking notice of it.
One further question?
Considering that Bolton was such a hardliner, now that he's out, do you see a change in policy for better or worse?
You'll see a change in my policy for better or worse. If all of a sudden, if the president signs and tries to go into some Iran deal, I've talked to a lot of my colleagues who are against the Iran deal. So we have to be consistent. president signs a bad deal, we have to criticize it also. We have to make sure that any dealings with our adversaries are dealings that survive election turnover, that are good for 10 to 20 years, instead of something that can be ripped up as soon as the next administration comes in. I hope there's a team of rivals at play. I hope there are the next national security advisor who should be appointed in the next 72 hours, because this is not a job you can just kind of wait on putting somebody in. Is not a yes man, is not a Roger out person. His military term, Roger out, yes sir. H.R. McMaster was the right guy for the National Security Council. Bolton was as well. We need another bulldog in the National Security Council that can mobilize, can argue, can build a team of rivals, and yet at the end of the day does what the president wants, but only after giving the president his best advice. That's all you can ask for.
Yeah, in terms of NSC, the way I conduct my approach is I want to read what that person, male or female, has written before, has said before. Somebody coming from the technological world with no knowledge of the region or foreign policy, or haven't said anything. I mean, in terms of John Bolton, first off, obviously he was a friend and colleague at Fox News. We've heard him for 15 years, but I've known what he has done at the United Nations Security Council, I've known what his policy was, so you could judge. If you have depth, you could judge and predict for the future. So my hope would be, and I think it's 7 days, the President said next week, it could be 72, but the next week, in 7 days we'll know. And the way I will judge would be about what were the achievements and the positions taken before.
Yeah. I have to add that John Bolton has been a friend of ours, a friend of EMET's. He is a great patriot. He's a great man. He knows the distinction between good and evil and right and wrong. And I don't think it's a good sign that he's been asked to leave the administration. And I hope it's not a sign that the president indeed wants to negotiate with Iran. Yes.
It's a strictly hypothetical question, and there's no way to answer it with any certainty, of course. But if Saddam Hussein, if the history were not to have been what it is, if Saddam Hussein were alive, what would have been his reaction to the developing nuclear program of Iran's? Would he have allowed the Iranians to go this far?
Right.
Would have there been more wars and so on? They were in a war, of course. What's your thoughts?
Well, I think the irony here is, I was a voice interceptor when I was enlisted a long time ago, so I worked for the National Security Agency and I listened to Iraqi communications. This isn't classical, but Saddam was so worried about Iran that it's Saddam's disinformation campaign that we captured on signals intelligence that led us to invade Iraq. So NSA hears that he has a nuclear program. He wants the Iranians to hear he has a nuclear program, so it deters them. Instead, it leads the U.S. to go with the WMDs. That's a part of it. But again, I don't do time travel foreign policy, but I think the irony is Saddam had a disinformation campaign and signals intelligence to hoping the Iranians were listening so that they would believe he had a capability he didn't have. Problem is we were listening.
Let me play a little bit. I do some time travel, and this one is going to be a little bit exotic. I publish about this. So, first you look at how long time is. We're talking 16 years. So that question in 2004 would be answered differently than today. So here's how I go. Look at most countries in the region, around Iraq and far from Iraq. Which of these countries is not involved in a massive, deep change without being invaded by the United States? Look at Syria. We have not invaded Syria. Syria has been going on in civil war and is now 3 Syrias. Look at Libya. We have not invaded Libya. Libya is minimum 2 to 3 Libyas. Look at Yemen. Same story. So, Lebanon, of course, and the other countries. My point is, it's not just about what we do. There are factors within those countries. The easiest thing for Western social continue to be like that for 16 years. Not true. We took a turn in history and invaded, and therefore we are responsible for what happened. But other things could have happened. One of the scenarios would have been if Saudi Arabia, which is the most stable, centralized country, and it doesn't have a lot of ethnic problems, is now vying for its survival, basically, because of the Shia erupt. So one of the things that could have happened in Iraq, if you study the trends, Iranian involvement in southern Iraq, with or without us, would have been going deep. The Iranians were planning on working on the Shia of southern Iraq, and Saddam knew it. Saddam made the mistake of Kuwait, so the Arab countries wouldn't have helped him that much. So take that one. Second, the Kurds. The Kurds were autonomous. The Kurds could have been also helped and went into that autonomy trend. And within the Sunni areas of Iraq, right, they all loved Saddam Hussein. They were Salafi jihadis. If Saddam would have been weakened by the Shia, guess what would have the jihadists done in central Iraq? They would have tried to get power. So 16 years, that's a long period of time. But the natural forces of Iraq would have tried, each one of them, to pull it towards them, the Shia radicals in the south, Sunni radicals in the center, and of course the Kurds in the north. It wouldn't have been that different from Syria at one point in time, in my view, my humble view.
Are there any further questions from the audience? Okay, now I'd like to give a rousing round of applause for the wonderful